Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome back to our series on mounds and memory. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleague, Professor Howard Williams from the University of Chester. I am Irina, by the way. And this is a series, like I said, called Mounds and Memory, where we discuss the archaeology and history of death and burial, mainly in the Viking Age, but we also touch upon other subjects as well. And today, I am very thrilled because Howard has prepared something extraordinary for us. Icelandic mortuary practices of the Viking Age. So I usually deal with the Icelandic sagas, and this makes me very happy because I'm hoping to make some connections between the two. So in Iceland, we do have some very interesting archaeological sites. Yeah, for example, the Mosfellsfjall Valley, which is very close to Reykjavik, Borgarfjörður and Hrísbrú. Here there have been discoveries, for example, of a longhouse, a stave church, as well as a pagan cremation site. So these bits of information that we sometimes might link to the sagas and sometimes maybe not. Let's see what Howard has to offer us on that account.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's a brilliant sort of sense of where we're going with this, because we've dealt with the sagas and we started in Scandinavia with the king sagas, all about Scandinavia. And then we came to Iceland to talk about the family sagas and the death rituals. And of course, hanging in the background for all of this, I hope all of the viewers and listeners will be thinking will be, and we'll get to it nearer the end, is, how do the sagas represent this? Are they accurate? Are they not? And I sort of to preface that by saying I think they actually are quite compelling remembrances of practices that at least echo very strongly in our archaeological evidence. Or
I think sometimes they can also be very useful because, as far as I know, they started the Mosfellsfjall archaeological project because they found some fragments in the saga of Ekit that offered some indication that there might have been something going on in the area. So those places are mentioned, like you said, they're preserved in the oral memory of the people, both in medieval times and then later on in folklore. Yeah.
So we're going to be dealing with memory in a number of different ways here. We're going to be dealing with memory, that in terms of these archaeological practices, these archaeologically attested practices of the late 9th, 10th, early mid 11th centuries are being remembered in the times of oral tradition and then written down, so that these are being remembered. But then, of course, what I'm hoping to get at as an archaeologist is how these practices tell us about the ways in which these societies constructed their own social memories. And so I was going to take us on a bit of a journey. So I thought I'd just start off with a really basic introduction to those that don't know. And I always need remembering when I'm teaching my students things. So I've got lots of text, but hopefully this will help guide people. And you've got to forgive any typos and also any bad pronunciations, which I'm hoping Irina will be able to correct me on. But, I'm never defend my pronunciation even of English place names, let alone Icelandic ones, because there's always things I don't know. But I wanted to start off by reminding you that we've recently had a TV show loosely set on about legends, rather than a historical drama. I find it difficult to call the TV show Vikings historical drama. It's it's a attempt.
It was promoted as such.
Yeah, I know, but we know otherwise. But they did. I think they did. Mm-hmm. There's a whole discussion we could do here. They did take advice from archaeologists about how to show funerals in Iceland, and they managed to make it utterly ridiculous, and yet somehow, in an aesthetic way, it does match up with some of our evidence. And so, it's like you can almost see how they got here, even though what we've got is nonsense. You can see almost how they got it. They wanted to go for a much poorer, simpler, more humble funerary rites than the ones they'd already showed in Norway, to reflect the fact that's a feature that is generally a standard generalization said about the Icelandic burial record of the pagan period, is it's not as exuberant, it's not as wealthy, and yet still they couldn't resist ship-shaped settings. They couldn't resist putting lots of random bits of antler for some reason, but also some objects. And the thing that there isn't here that we'll get onto is horse sacrifice, because animal ethics for TV shows, even if they're not even harming the lovely beasts, people get very upset. They don't mind people gouging and killing and decapitating each other. The second you hurt a little beastie, people get very upset. So they obviously
there was definitely a lot of gory stuff going on. I mean, even when reading Ibn Fadlan's account, it was much gorier than, for example, the 13th Warrior represented it.
Oh yes, everything is massive. So we have in this perverse world where our TV screens are full of mass death, our fiction is full of mass death, and yet equally well, I mean, rightly we should be squeamish about slaughtering beasties, but equally that is one of the key features of the Icelandic burial record, and they just couldn't or didn't. They decided not to, whichever way you look at it, depict it. And so we have Iceland's first cemetery, which is actually quite compelling. Low stone settings, the idea of rituals and mourners attending, but of course the location is ridiculous. The whole first settlement in this TV show is by some geysers in the middle of central Iceland, away from the coast where all their food would be coming from. So none of it actually makes sense. As long as I wanted to introduce this to make the point that this is all nonsense on the TV show, but equally I respect the decisions they made, because you can see how it was informed by our archaeological record. It's not reflecting our archaeological record, but you can see almost like the sagas themselves, you can see how the archaeology echoed down the design process to get to this.
It's like filtered through multiple layers.
So none of this is a window onto the Viking Age, but I have to begin with this to remind people this is a ridiculous fiction, and yet they've tried to show settlers in a relatively inhospitable land. Obviously, Iceland was a lot more leafy and wooded than this representation of 21st century Iceland where they were filming. But you've got a sense they've tried to make a connection by showing graves close to settlements, following their Norwegian or Western Viking Age mortuary practices, but adapting them with less material evidence. And so following David Zori, who does a nice review in 2016, his synopsis would be that there's a question of, are we looking at an overt pagan ethnic identity in death? I mean, this seems to be, no one says it quite that overtly, but the implicit assumption of the Icelandic historical and archaeological tradition is that the Icelanders are asserting a pagan ethnic identity that's distinctive in their pioneering communities. Now, this for me smacks of a romantic nationalistic discourse that's still going on. They would deny that, I think, but I still get a feeling that the idea that everyone was going around going, we are Icelanders with our pride tradition, and we are, that seems to come through in even some of the academic literature written quite recently.
I think it had to do a little bit with some press statements that were made a couple of years ago about this new form of paganism in Iceland. The Ásatru Fellagið, which is actually, it's not that bad of an association if you compare it with other sorts of ethnic neo-paganism, because they do acknowledge the fact that they have great limitations in their sources, and it's sort of like more of a art religion, or a mix of art and religion.
But scholars like Zori still make this argument that there is some kind of shared uniformity in life and death, linking to a Viking Age culture. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked into this. I'm just giving you, this is the standard approach to the burial evidence. So there's hints of that the pagan Norse had Irish and Slavic influence. There's much debate about that. But we are dealing with a paganism, and this is the way Zori describes it, which I think this is quite a useful starting point. That you're not dealing with a hierarchical society with a text-structured orthodoxy. You're looking at diverse, changeable, local, and decentralized, and that's true across the Viking world. But it applies to Iceland, and then informs the burial practice. We would expect to see lots of local variation. We've got archaeological evidence of fire-cracked stones and cooking pits at some sites that may be linked to, cultic practice, sacrifice and rituals. We wouldn't expect a conformity, because there's no text-based religion and no structured.
There's no codified religiosity or anything doctrinal.
But there is still an idea that there is, the burial record is less variable and distinctive because it's settlers who want to define themselves in relation to their landscape, and they're not just simple. It's not simply about being poor, simple, and homogeneous. There is something about the colonial experience, the settling experience, that is a common argument in the literature. And most of the burials seem to date from this 850 to 1050 sort of bracket. That late, that's the furnished burials. We're seeing the settlement of Iceland in the later 9th century, and then we can't precisely pin down exact dates, but we've got radiocarbon dates now that can get us down to 40 to 25 years. So we're getting closer to a sort of generational view, but a lot of the burials still aren't properly dated. But we're starting to get.
This is very interesting because it's an interesting parallel to draw to the Book of Settlements here, to the Landnámabók, because again here in this work you can see this complexity of religion that people would have brought with them. I mean, we have Christian characters, we have overtly pagan characters such as Thorolfur Mostraskeg, who is a great worshipper of the god Thor, for example, and then we have other people who are like a bit uncertain. Like there is this character called Helgi the Lean. I always like this character because he's like, yeah, I'm going to worship Thor when I'm on sea, and then when I come to land, I'm just going to worship Jesus. So they would have also been a little pragmatic.
I like the Aqua Thor and Land Jesus. Like this would be so tough.
Yeah.
That's good. And yes, so you've got that sense of diversity. So we've got around, since most of these are antiquarian finds, this is the problem, is that most of these are poorly recorded, found by accident. So this is true of any part of Europe, right? And just again, I'm just explaining for audiences who may not be aware. Just because we've got 316 graves sounds like a good sample, but those are over 157 burial locations. That tells you immediately that for any burial location you're getting an average of 2 graves. You've got some that are more, and we'll come across those, but this means that people are discovering them by accident and not doing extensive excavations. And archaeology relies not simply on careful analysis of individual graves, but understanding the cemeteries, and we don't really have that for Iceland. There's only a handful of sites where we're starting to understand the broader burial geography. So I'll come back to that point. Most of the assumption was that we're dealing with isolated graves at prominent visible locations, such as overlooking roads, on boundaries between farm properties, and the idea that these are burials on the edge. And that idea still comes through in the literature. I'm a bit skeptical about how the language we use for this, and I'll come back to this at some point, because this often gets equated in the literature with marginal, as if they're not important or they're away from the living. And there's a broader historiographical or archaeographical problem here of trying to see the pagan dead as fearful and away, when actually
they would have been integrated in the landscape nevertheless.
Yeah. As we talked about last time, these were places people saying you're on a road is not like some kind of 18th century or
maybe liminal is the better term for that somehow.
Yeah, because that's very different than marginal, because you're between places but on routes that people are traversing. You're putting the dead on property, not just to mark land ownership and territory, but so you can encounter the dead, interact with the dead. And I think that people forget that. So when we look at most of the evidence comes of isolated burials, but this is a mirage. This is because people simply haven't dug enough to see if there are other graves in most cases. So this isolated status is now recognized as misleading. For every grave, you've probably got dozens more that haven't been dug. And this is another issue that's a bit of a mirage. The standard argument is there's not big burial mounds. So that's why the TV show Vikings went for those little humble little coverings, and people say, well, the sagas mention large burial mounds, or so why aren't we finding
because
them?
That was the Christian representation. I mean, the Christian representation of pagan burial is also quite limited. I mean, what do we know about heathens? What would have heathens do, generally speaking? Well, they would have buried their people in these mounds, these huge mounds, to show how important they were.
And that's the bias that they're the ones you're seeing surviving. So there's a self-perpetuating myth here that if you're in a landscape where the only mounds you can still see are mounds, big mounds, then you're forgetting the fact that actually most of the mounds are naturally modified. So you don't, unless you're an archaeologist, you won't know whether it's a fully human-made or natural one. And of course, erosion has happened over the last 1,000 years. So a lot of the more ephemeral grave markers have gone. So I think we're probably in a position, I'm speaking my take on it. I don't think the literature I've read has been very categorical, but my sense is that the Christian memory of that period is wrong, but also it's not completely wrong, because I think the descriptions are perhaps being misunderstood. That there would have been a tradition of mound raising, just not vast, great Oseberg, Gokstads type mounds from Vestfold in Norway. We're talking about more modest cappings of graves with stones and earth, and we'll come back to some examples of that. So just to reiterate, most of the graves are found during construction, so we've already lost the surface traces. So we're often, a lot of the early excavations, we've just found they're obsessed with finding the bones and the artifacts, and they haven't even bothered looking for stone arrangements, post holes, stake holes, mound coverings. And the other thing that, again, is a broad archaeological point that maybe people don't know is mounds are often only visible if they dug a ditch to build the mound, but you don't need to do that. And we know from the Viking age, such as in the Isle of Man, they were making Viking period mounds out of turfs. In other words, they were stripping large areas of a very shallow level and making substantial mounds out of the turf covering. That wouldn't leave a trace. That wouldn't leave ditches that then allow you to see the circle of the edge of the mound. So, and that's true of everywhere in Europe. Just because you don't find ring ditches doesn't mean they didn't have mounds. They could have just been building them in a different way. And we have from Denmark in the Bronze Age, turf-built mounds that have been analysed in great detail. Likewise in the Isle of Man in the Viking Age. So I'm just making that point to remind people that there's many ways in which you can build a big mound or just a modest mound, and we wouldn't necessarily find traces of that, and they're probably using natural features as well. The argument is they're shallow graves surrounded by stones covered then with different kinds of soil, but I think there would have been other kinds of marker. The other thing that's often said, and again I'm surprised by a lot of the general literature, they still perpetuate this stereotype. They say grave goods are modest. Now, again, this is a general point to remind our listeners and viewers that when we talk about grave goods, we're talking about a fraction of the objects that are likely to be associated with that grave, just as a rule, because anything in the acidic soils, in the volcanic acidic soils of the North Atlantic, a lot of the textiles, a lot of the leather, a lot of the wood, we do have some of this survive actually, but only in interaction with metallic objects there's been a chemical exchange process that creates the objects of the textile is preserved, almost fossilized by the chemical exchange with the
conservation bias.
So but we've got to remember that in a society that isn't a monetary society, we know, as I saw in one of your recent videos, you were talking about that in Iceland it was cloth had a tradable
the badmol,
So we've got to be aware that this is a society where the valued commodities may not be the same as elsewhere. If there's less silver, well, frankly, there's not much silver going into graves, even in Viking Scandinavia, where we know silver was such an important part of the economy, because they know if they put silver in there, it's going to be looted immediately. So actually, graves don't get a lot of silver objects anyway, but certainly in Iceland, you calling it modest grave goods is probably missing the point that they're what the objects that they value are different. And many of the objects that they are putting in the graves are probably organic, and we're not seeing them surviving. So I just wanted to sort of remind people. So when we say, oh, it's a poor grave, like everyone's got in their mind a BJ 581 chamber grave as a typical Viking burial. No way. Most graves are going to be either have no grave goods, a few humble objects associated with clothing. And that's the same for Iceland. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that in a North Atlantic colony where their sea resources, land resources are going to be perishable, their economy is not going to have that access to the same minerals and resources. They're not going to be putting in graves. It doesn't mean they're cheapskates. It just means that they're not using in the funerary economy. They're not able to sacrifice to the grave many objects of inorganic nature. That doesn't mean that they're poor. It just means that they've got.
I think you're making a very important point here, because I wanted to say that as well. That even if, let's say, hypothetically speaking, that the fact that they don't have a lot of grave goods actually means that they didn't have a lot of grave goods, that also has to do with the limited resources these people had, and the fact that it would have been much more useful to reintegrate them in the economy, like in the active economy, rather than just place them in graves.
Absolutely. I mean, and the thing is, because we find some societies in early medieval Europe that do put things in graves, we should remember all early medieval societies are recycling societies. You know, the default is that you're remaking things. You're not throwing things away unless in absolute specific socially obligated circumstances. So don't get the impression, not you, I'm saying readers, listeners, viewers, whatever, that most of these societies are constantly just giving, sacrifice everything. No, they're being very selective. And so it's exceptional.
Yeah, this reminded me again of the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, you know, when Hervor goes to ask that sword from her father. And that's the main argument. Like, this was not supposed to be yours. I mean, it was yours, but now it's rightfully my inheritance. So give it back to me. Yeah.
And the other thing, this is another bugbear. And so, you know, if people haven't got the impression, I'm not giving you just what other people say. I've put Zori here as a quote, but this is my spin on things. So the standard argument is cremation is rare in Iceland because there's no trees.
Yeah.
Well, that's a non-argument, right? And I'll come back to this, is that I think a lot of the problem with cremation across Europe is we're failing to find them. We're failing to identify cremations when we find them. They think it's just a patch of burnt earth. And the argument that they wouldn't have cremated because of scarcity of wood. Well, okay, you don't have full-grown trees in Iceland, and they rapidly, the pollen record shows that they rapidly got rid of the birch forests, right? Yep. But they had driftwood. And the other point I would make is you don't need wood to burn a body. And we've got evidence from Pictish cremations from the Orkney Islands showing us that they're probably using seaweed. In other words, there's other, and peat. In other words, there's other resort. You can burn a body. It's a different technology, but if you feel socially and religiously obligated to burn the dead, it's not, I would do, but you know, what can I do? There will be resources. And I strongly suspect that the lack of available trees is a part of the story, because it's not simply having the trees. You've got to dry the wood. Most societies that cremate use dried wood, that you've basically part of your stock of fuel that you're keeping for your winter. So if you're having to burn people, you don't want to freeze in winter. You've got to make a choice. So it's a very cold environment, a very dry environment, and it's also a very treeless environment. So I'm not denying that the lack of wood is part of the picture, but I don't believe if they wanted to burn the dead, they could have and would have, and we know they did, at least from the saga literature. There's a hint that there was a remembrance of a tradition that in exceptional circumstances, but wrong-uns, the glams and the people that come back, the bad dead, the revenants.
I think that's the only context where we find cremation in the sagas, as far as I know, for these people who are considered deviant in society. Yeah.
So I think we're missing not a lot. I don't think they were all cremated. I think we're missing some, and I think we're missing, and I don't think scarcity of wood is enough of a justification. It's a cultural choice. Yes, it's a cultural choice. It's informed by environment and technology, but I don't think it's the only reason. We don't have evidence of human sacrifice. I know everyone will be going, oh, really? I like that bit. I like a bit of, but no, we don't have any evidence for that. There's a debate in mainland Scandinavia about Viking Age human sacrifice. And I think on balance, you could say, yeah, maybe. But it's certainly not.
Yeah, there is one reference, as far as I know, in Landnámabók, where is this again? There is this guy Thorolf Mostraskeg, and he has this whole conflict with some people who don't want to respect, like the gathering place, which was near a temple of Thor, because they had a special place there where you went to do your business, like pee. Yeah. But there were some people who didn't respect that. So they had this conflict, and they had to move the gathering, and they moved it to a place called Thor's Boulder or something like that, where it is described sacrifices took place, human sacrifices in the name of Thor. But that's just maybe a funny detail in the story. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And, so there may have been human sacrifice in exceptional circumstances. I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying we don't have any archaeological evidence to speak to that, but we do have evidence of animal sacrifice in a big scale. And so I thought, giving you that introduction, give you a sense of what we're looking at. Generally poorer graves, but were they poor? No cremation, but is that because we haven't spotted some of it? I'm not saying large numbers, but maybe, small burial mounds, but are we missing some of them, and other structures, isolated graves, but actually that's probably because we haven't dug far enough. In other words, there's lots of limits to the evidence. I thought I'd give a sort of positive start off by looking at a biography of a lady's grave from the 10th century from Ketilstaðir, if I get that right. And this is published in Medieval Archaeology from 2019. And I thought it'd be a good example to show you what we can learn, because this was excavated a while ago. The artist, there's a whole debate we can have about the artist's reconstruction and what's going on here, but let's not go there. Let's just say this is what the grave may have looked like if it had been found with, in reality, of course, it's just some bones on an individual laid on their side with artifacts with them. This is from the far east of Iceland. And an isolated grave, I believe, or I know one of a small group of graves from the early 10th century. And what I think is really interesting, it's a case study in re-examining a historical discovery. So these remains were still in the National Museum of Iceland. And the study looked at the dress, the grave goods. They used isotopic evidence and AMS, that's accelerated mass spectroscopy. That's the advanced form of radiocarbon dating we now have to build up a picture of this woman at a point of burial. And it's a rather meandering article, if they say so, but they were able to, the short of it is they were able to show that she's late 9th, early 10th century radiocarbon date, which fits with what the artifacts tell us. This for Iceland, early Viking world, but you could call it, I get the chronologies get mid-Viking age if you wanted to go that way for the mainland Viking phenomenon. It's not, there's no, obviously we don't have any late 8th, early mid-9th century graves at all. So this is, and the stabilized notes hint that she may have had a childhood origin in the British Isles and came here as a young person. Which shows again a point we find in the sagas. You know, people aren't coming straight from Scandinavia. They are already immigrants. They're already part of a hybridized diaspora by the time they reached Iceland. They're, you know, the DNA evidence is showing us a people, a British/Irish Celtic contribution.
Yeah, the Celtic element.
Yeah. So and I suppose what's really good about this is the grave is a window onto life, in the sense that they're not really, this paper isn't really interested in the burial practice. I'll come on to that a little later on, but they do talk about how the costume is an expression of cultural identity in this period, and it's very much showing a world that's very broad geographically, very tight, but very shared practices. So the burial customs and the grave goods show an affinity with not just Scandinavia but with the British Isles and beyond. And so they talk about, they don't really theorize this, and this is a point that as previous watchers of our previous conversations, I've got a big bugbear that we've got to theorize this properly, but they make this kind of cagey view. They say, well, the burial is reflecting her desires and those closely interlinked with her, which is a nice way of getting out of the problem of, well, are these her choices? Is this bury me on my side with my favorite brooches, or is this a let us give her grandmother's brooches and her husband's sister's necklace and her her niece's knife? And we don't understand the choices made about these objects and how they got them. But she's on her side, she's flexed on her left side, which is actually a very distinctive position, because we do get a lot of burials that are extended supine, in other words on the back straight out, but a lot of these burials in Iceland do seem to be positioned in a crouched position. You could say that's a space expediency, that you can dig a smaller grave pit, and so you could see it as that's what they did because of laziness or rushing, but it is a distinctive feature of these burials. Unlike the Vikings TV show, a lot of them seem to be flexed. Now, I haven't seen a study of the proportions of burials on left right side, and maybe that's because I haven't read enough, or maybe we don't have the evidence to make a pattern, but that does seem to be a feature of many of these burials. And she has a range of objects that are really interesting. So she has her 2 oval brooches. Sometimes you'll see them called tortoise brooches. We've come across them before. These are the sort of standard traditional Viking age, early mid-Viking age sort of dress accessories of adult women, with a trefoil brooch, which I'll show you in a little while. We've got a touchstone, a possible other touchstone or a whetstone. There's obviously a knife because we've got its bone handle, but we don't have the blade. There's a spindle whirl, and I always never know how to say this. Is it chalcedony, the red, blue, grey piece of rock, which may be another amulet. So there's objects here that speak of display in the person's costume, but also objects that are more intimate, and perhaps amulets and objects of daily use.
Has there any research been done on the touchstone or whetstone? That would have also been interesting to figure out where they might have come from, these objects.
Yeah, I didn't. Unless I missed it in the paper, I don't think they did mention that in this study. but the brooches are these are standard P52 brooches. These are sort of standard. They're a pair. And this is important because I'll come back to a grave later which doesn't have a pair, has one. But the idea is that these are, whether these were hers or her family's, they are kind of, they tend to be matching pairs or very closely matching pairs, as are these. And they would have originally, you can see the worn off here, there wouldn't have been this verdigris color. They would have obviously been shiny golden when originally constructed. You've got gilt on some of it surviving, but of course the color it doesn't give the same impression. And you've got a gilt trefoil brooch, and these are really amazing objects because they get used as in the Viking world, they're female dress accessories, but they originally come and inspired by Carolingian horse fittings. So women's style, if you went to the center of the Frankish world, they'd be going, why on earth are you wearing stuff that our horses wear?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if that conversation ever happened, but that would have been one of those amusing, well, I don't like your shoes, you're wearing the type of things that we would give to the dogs or whatever, you can imagine the arguments going on. But this is a really interesting sort of cultural transfer of Frankish horse gear into
repurposing objects in a new context.
So repurposing original objects and then repurposing the idea of a trefoil brooch. So you got this brooch as well. So this would probably have been fixing the another garment, not the over apron, but the undergarment. So you also have the beads, a range of different coloured beads, glass beads, and also an amber bead. And so there's a lot of detail here, but the point is they were able to use this evidence to reconstruct the costume. So if I just quickly go back, so the idea is this is kind of informed by the archaeological evidence. So you'd have a blue coloured over apron, and then a most likely wool, and then an undergarment of linen. And so you've got sort of the argument that the authors are making is it's kind of bricolage of elements showing cultural hybridity. So the long chemise, most likely pleated linen, fastened at the neck with the trefoil brooch, and then a pair of the P52 oval brooches attaching to the apron smocker. And the argument by Michelle Hare Smith is that these are the perhaps symbols of marital status, or at least wealthy women, if not, heads of the household would have these kind of display of their maturity, their motherhood, maybe, this kind of, or at least their economic power and independence and wealth and marital associations, kin group status.
I know from other places, perhaps we could draw a parallel here. For example, in the island of Gotland, if I'm not mistaken, your status as a woman very much dependent on how many beads you would have had with you in the grave or something like that.
Yeah. So yes, exactly. So and she's got 42 beads, which is actually a lot of beads. So glass, jet, lignite, amber. The amber could come from Britain, but it could be also from the Baltic, most likely from the Baltic. But we do have British amber. The jet is from Whitby. So you got lignite from southern Scotland. So this kind of grave is a sort of captures the trade and the connections of the Viking world. And they also go into perhaps some of the potential amuletic significance in this article about the objects. So the chalcedony is known from Icelandic as a ghost stone, and the blue shade may match the link with death and burial, and the blue color, they argue, may be linked to, I don't know how much you believe this, with the not only with the costume, that it was was this blue dress her standard dress, or was it a dress seen as appropriate for death, for funerals?
And I think it might have something to do with status, more like a status symbol of some sort. She would have been someone important in society, as far as I can understand from this presentation. But the connection with death, I'm not very sure about it. I do know that the color blue does pop a lot in contexts where there is some kind of killing involved, like in sagas where when you're about to go to kill someone, you're going to get dressed in blue. In that context, I don't know if it's a good match here.
Right. You see, I mean, the article sort of hedges its bets a little bit here because, of course, they don't know and we're guessing. But, this is where the academic language is a little frustrating because they do make a fact. They try to talk about, and I think this is a really good way of thinking about it. But it's very much the idealized, stylized dresses of Freya are maybe represented. So everybody's dressed, no matter how rich they are, how poor they are, maybe incorporating into their dress objects that have symbolic and social import and mythological storytelling about them. And I think that's a really healthy way to think about it. But equally, we're still trying to think about, well, was this done in for the funeral? Is this just their daily dress and they're just being dressed in their best clothes?
Yeah.
There's a whole series of debates about that. But the reason, and you've got some of the textiles surviving on here and the linen fragments, and also you can see there's a lot of details I can share here about the textiles, including they've got some of the elements surviving of the apron and a strap. And their whole point, really, just to quickly skim through this, is that some of the spinning techniques show links to the British Isles and Norway as well. So and you may be looking at some of these objects, maybe old items, made in the woman's, grandparents' days when the first settlement of Iceland. So these objects may be storied. They may have biographies to them too. And and the colors, were the colors selected for the funeral, or is this a coincidence that blue, black, semantic overlapping may have been significant in the colors of the brooches, the dress and the beads? So at one level they're trying to say, and this is my evaluation of their piece, is it's a really good article that shows you how much we can piece together from a historic find, and then we can talk about this individual's clothing, how it may be objects that are handed down from past generations, how it captures the connections with the Eastern Mediterranean and the Byzantine objects of the glass beads originally, whether she knew it or not. The glass beads originally came from the Byzantine world, British Isles, Scandinavia. But then equally, what I was frustrated with the article is there's no, and this is where hopefully the next piece of work will pick up, even though it's an older piece of work, is they don't really theorize the consideration of death ritual and the role of these objects in the funerary ritual. Are they just like, yeah, bury her in the old stuff, bury her in the best stuff, or how much there was individual thought and selection in the burial ritual? And I would argue, as a starting point, we have to start with that point, that these are carefully curated, selected items that had stories to tell them. But I'll stop there just in case I've gone through too much and see what
you think. It's very difficult to figure it out. I mean, to me, as a historian, so not as an archaeologist, I think it's such a difficult question, like figuring out whether this person really chose the objects for themselves or whether they were chosen by somebody else, because we don't really, I mean, how do you approach this, generally speaking? Can we know at all?
Well, I think if you're looking at old worn objects, that will tell you one thing, but it will tell you something that's beyond that person's lifestyle. If they're a young person, we have early Anglo-Saxon graves here, we can clearly see young women who die and they're given very old worn brooches, and then you've got old women who have very very curated brooches, very pristine brooches. So it doesn't pin it down exactly, but we do have you can see some disparities between young people, young objects, old people, old objects. But I still think it's a fascinating issue, and I suppose the answer is, well, there's no single answer, but trying to treat the burial as a captured life lived is perhaps not particularly helpful. There, when it's probably lots of different agents are involved, lots of different authors to a grave, as we've talked about before, that went into making these decisions. And that's very much where I wanted to go next, really, and talk about an article that's way back from 2009 by Thora Pettersdottir, who looks at how to rethink these graves from Iceland and get away from the stereotype that they're all poor and all rubbish, right? And so she tries to suggest ways we can theorize these graves in more meaningful ways, which is really what the journey I've been trying to take us on from the archaeological point of view already. And so she, her approach is, again, I'm not going to fully endorse it because there's limitations to what she says, as with any study. So I'm not trying to be dismissive, but she says, graves have often been used as like taps of information to discuss the settlement process, landnam, the population origins, where they come from, where their trade links are, very much like what we saw with the Ketilstadir grave, right? But we don't look at them as the results of mortuary practice. So Thora's taking a very much an approach that I have a lot of sympathies with, is that first and foremost, we have to work out and interrogate this as part of a death ritual. And then doesn't mean we can't say anything about the life and the people and that are involved, but we've got to understand what these objects are doing in the burial ritual. And so she says, I mean, this is the term, this is very much the way I would look at it, is she says we need to see the material in our own terms. And the most of the graves, she goes through the fact what I've already said, most of them are found by accident. We're dealing with a limited data set, they're not systematically analysed. And the antiquarian approaches have tended to be very self-dismissive. Norwegian data is better. Everyone's data is always better with archaeologists. This is true, but particularly with early archaeologists, as everyone else is the Nordic data. Is better. But the aim has been to try and how can we make this data work for the sagas? How can we make it tell us about the sagas? We already know what happened because the sagas tell us what happened. How do we make the archaeology? Can we find people in the sagas? And even Shetelig, the famous early archaeologist who was involved in the excavation of Oseberg, said they're all poor, lack of cremation, poor, unprepossessing graves in Iceland. So it's all just beggarly colonists. It's very colonial view. It's very, you expect a British archaeologist to say about some sort of outer edge of Britain. Very much the way British archaeologists are talking about the inhabitants of Shetland and Orkney and the Western Isles. This seems to be playing out in a Norwegian archaeologist coming to Iceland, looking rifling through the museum and going, oh, poor unprepossessing stuff.
Yeah, because for a very long time there has been this focus on mortuary evidence only showing you social status and social differences.
Yes.
And it's
big mound, big boats, power, exactly, status. Yeah. And then, oh, look, some women were powerful too, and that's about as far as you go, and that's it, But yeah, so there's been a recent republication, or 2020, of Eldjan's categorization of the graves, but it's very much focused on typology and chronology and origins. What are the influences? The Scandinavian origins. The other problem is we do have some findless graves as well, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're Christian. It just means they may be thralls, or they may be people who had organic objects that we don't have surviving. So we can't be sure. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So the fact we don't have objects in some graves doesn't tell us necessarily they were poor. It doesn't necessarily tell us they were low status. It doesn't necessarily mean they had no objects. But this is the compilation from her article based on Eldjan and the objects we have. Now, we're going to come back to horses. Calling horses grave goods, I think, is a problem in itself, right? But the most common object after that are spearheads, knives. These are sort of masculine. Well, the knives aren't. Spearheads tend to be seen as a masculine item, but
and they were very common. I think it was among the most common objects you would have found.
Yeah, but these could be repurposed in domestic context, and
absolutely, yeah.
And probably many people could use a spear for hunting and for fishing and for combat. So that default assumption of warrior is something we've talked about before. But often, this is from all of the corpus of the graves up until the present. Knives, beads, obviously, as we've seen, a part of more feminine adult dress. Saddle remains linked to the horses often. Whetstones, axes, bridles. Again, horses are dominant here. Oval brooches. We've got 23 oval brooches, or pairs of oval brooches, I think these are, or graves with oval brooches, so more than one in most cases. Then you've got dogs, combs, textile fragments, swords, 17 swords have been found, striker likes, shield bosses, cauldrons. Now, I haven't seen a systematic comparison of this with Norwegian corpuses, but there's some obvious. This is overall quite poor. It's not a rich corpus, but of course, as I said, it relies on metal finds, and we're not going to have many of the organic objects that's such an important part of people's lives. People are living in long houses with bowls and artifacts made out of a range of organic materials.
Surprises me how few spindle whorls are in this.
In the graves, yes, and that is actually table, quite interesting, isn't it? We only got 4.
Or gaming pieces, for that matter. Yeah.
I mean, that is, again, I think that's 3 graves with lots of gaming pieces. But then gaming pieces can be made of lots of material that you don't have surviving. So you can make lots of games out of wood and bone that wouldn't necessarily survive in the soil. So it depends on those local conditions. But yes, no, I do agree. That is really, really odd. So Pettersdottir says that there's weapons, spears, and axes. There tends to be traditions here. So here's a grave. I think it's got a spearhead with a dog at the feet of the grave. Again, a flex burial. So that's the human head. There's the legs, and that's the doggo at the feet, a sacrificed dog. We have shields are often placed over the head. A lot of other objects are placed by the waist where you expect them. They're probably concealed within leather or textile pouches that haven't survived. So not all these objects were for display in some lavish procession and funeral. And we find animals tend to be placed at the foot of the grave if they're dogs. Horses sometimes get a separate pit. So it's almost like two burials. So we'll come back to that in a little while. So here's a woman and a horse in the same undivided grave. So a woman and a horse buried together in this grave. I won't pronounce the place name. I'll leave that to you.
Okay.
That's better than I can do. And, you know, Pettersdottir gives some saga context, which I'd love to hear your views on, saying that, you know, the choices of objects are probably going to be very significant. I know these are later remembrances, but we have Gunnar's halberd and the dispute over its disposal. We have weapons that are given names. You know, this is stuff that's been just talked about a lot. And we should therefore, as a default, we shouldn't see these objects as simply just mundane possessions. They should, and even the everyday objects such as pots and knives may be very important for people. If not that person, then the group who are making the decision to place it. And she makes the point, and this is into the territory of standard archaeological theory, which I take with a pinch of salt, but she does make the point that, you know, seeing these as not human when they could be objects that are intimately linked to family groups, kinship groups, exchange relationships between groups. When we're seeing these objects selected for death rituals, we've got to think these objects may have had quite significant meanings to them. And things may have stories. They may be biographical objects like memory boxes that are linked through exchange to stories of where people came from and who they are. So these objects may have been really important even though they were humble objects. She's trying to say, let's not rule them out just because they're not massive, great, you know, ships and weapon sets. These objects may have been really important in interconnecting and renegotiating relationships between the living and the dead. Oh, actually, I added that bit because she doesn't quite get there in the argument, but I think that's what she's getting at.
I think she's using the new thing theory, like the new materialism, this whole idea that material and immaterial culture are not really that well separated. And this is something that it's also based on like some contemporary observations for the fact, for example, the simple fact that we are very much attached to our smartphones nowadays, or there are surgical practices where you get like the artificial limbs, for example. So everything is very much interconnected, both material and immaterial.
Yes, and anthropologists have talked about this, from Marilyn Strathern, Janet Hoskins, and Hoskins is cited in this paper, but also the Danny Miller work and people like that who've looked at contemporary our society, as you rightly say. So, I mean, I think this is a really healthy way of thinking about these things rather than simply counting them up and thinking about them. But what I said I added a bit is that she doesn't really get to the point that this is about a renegotiation, which is what kind of my publications have been about, not for Icelandic burials, but for other burials, is that it's not that these are identities that are fixed anyway. You're in a ritual that's about transforming and renegotiating the relationships between the living and the dead, but we don't need to delve into that right now. But she comes up with some examples of I meant known things, not know things. The corporal presence in relation to known things, of remembering and forgetting of social bonds through the choices and placements. So we may be looking at very careful decisions about how and where things are placed. And she picks up some examples. And this is one of the weaknesses of the article, is that she doesn't dive into examples of how these objects are actually used, but she uses some example about an elaborate sword from one grave, an unusual spear from another, the oval and trefoil brooches from Ketilstadir we talked about, the tongue-shaped brooches from another side, lignite armoring. These are very individualistic objects, but they may have had really important stories that created the social bonds between the living and the dead. That's I think. But so she's trying to sort of advocate new approaches to not only the objects that are very prominent, but also the very sort of almost secret objects, the pieces of flint and jasper, striker lights, combs, weights, spindle whorls. So she talks about these small objects as seen as worthless, rather than, she's countering the view of seeing them as worthless reflections of eccentricity and superstition, as other archaeologists have assumed, and trying to think about them as maybe these objects had meaningful selections and associations with the living and the dead. And she talks about old and worn things, whetstones and knives, sooty soapstone cauldrons and combs. So the point she's trying to get at, I think, is a really important one. I just wish the article then took us into some of the more detail of how we can then analyze these objects and how they had a role in the funeral. So the axe from Stralmor she talks about is unusual small, related to a young person. So there's that parallel between the biography of the person and the object they're with, whether it was their personal possession or someone else. So our overall point is let's not focus so much on categorizing the objects and saying, oh, all the graves are poorer than elsewhere, and trying to think through, these are the traces of people's lives, that we can't reconstruct everything about their lives. But I think for me, these two studies work together. The focus on the Ketilstadir women's grave gives a sort of snapshot, but it needed to be matched up with Pettersdottir's article, which tries to theorize grave goods in a much more nuanced way, as you say, drawing on thing theory and thinking about how these objects had a material agency connected to the personhood of the living and the dead. But then Pettersdottir isn't able to go into the detail of how that would work for individual graves. So for me, we need kind of both approaches, that sort of detailed analysis of objects in one grave, but then to try and match that up with understanding how these objects worked within the funeral. Oh, and that's what I said.
I think the sagas might inform a little bit on this account, because in the sagas you always have like these very personified objects, like the touchstones or swords or rings, and each of them has like sort of a bit of a story when they are used by the characters. And there is one example I like, for example, in the saga of Egil and Osmund. At some point, one of the characters loses one of his hands, and then a weapon is placed. Like, it sounds a little bit like X-Men, but
yes,
but like this informs this idea that it would have been a character so attached to his weapons that they basically become one at some point.
Exactly. It's that idea of a distributed personhood that is linked to the objects, and the objects then linked to the stories of others. Yeah. So this is the kind of ideas that archaeologists have been bashing around for 25 years now. What I feel the problem with this approach, as I said, is, and I put it here, is that it needs to be linked back to what I would call the mnemonic citations. If you're going to make that argument, you need to start exploring how those objects worked in relation to the community, but also not just about the things, the objects, but also the bodies, the structures, the monuments, the landscape. You can't just look at a lot of this work is still looking at the grave as an isolated
so you need the broader context.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot more. This work is good work, and I'm not wishing to denigrate it, but I haven't seen it being picked up and integrated into a proper approach that allows us to think about how these grave goods worked in relation to the body position, the choices of animal sacrifice, and the wider landscape, monuments and landscape. Although I'm going to build it up with the next case study to show you how we can then do that a little bit if we have time. So this is the approach that I think Frida Espelin Nordstein attempts in her 2020 Gothenburg thesis, Processing Death, Oval Brooches and Viking Graves in Britain, Ireland and Iceland. And I think what she's trying to do is build on some of the work I've done and others have done, looking at memory and how funerary processes at times of remembering and forgetting. And she applies that to what she calls thanatographies, looking at specific stories of graves and their ritual sequence. Now, her approach is to this. This is one of the few cemeteries we have from Iceland from this pagan period. This is Dalvík. Do we say Dalvík?
Dalvík, yeah.
Yeah. So Dalvík, and she looks at one grave, but I want to sort of foreshadow that by saying there is a broader cemetery here with different burials, and we're going to where you can almost see a careful. We don't know the exact chronology of the graves, but you can see they're following a sequence of orientation, and along the edge of the fjord, and they're they performed in relation to each other. So here memory is working in not the individual graves alone, but then how people respond and add further graves. So I think if we're going to do this work, just if we're going to build, as I argue, on what Pettersdottir has done and say, yeah, these objects were meaningful, but how did they work in a cemetery context? We've got to take it forward as Norstein does and try and argue, well, let's look at the individual graves and the sequences of objects.
Right.
And so we can't prove, we can never get at a definitive answer, but what she does is, I think it's really interesting with Dalvik 5, the 5th grave. So here's the plan, and you've got a south-north orientated, well, southwest to northeast orientated human skeleton. And then there's a second pit to the north. I'll just show you back on the plan. Here it is. Here it's at the very end of grave 4, so which is a boat grave. So it's actually aligned on a boat grave, or the boat graves are lined on it. We don't know which way around it went, right? But you've got a horse. A horse is sacrificed and put in a pit here. And you've got the human body is in a comparably sized space, a little narrower, obviously, but to the southwest. And what she's trying to do is get at, how do we think about how these objects work, if they are significant, within the sequence of the funeral, of remembering and forgetting the dead person? Because funerals are about this process of renegotiating, of trying to...
What do you remember? What do you forget?
Yeah. What are the things we're going to celebrate? He was a kind, loving husband, apart from the time when he got drunk and hit his kids, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Things you don't. But materially, we can't see that kind of epitaph. But if graves
like
are
it works selectively, I think. Selective
yeah.
forgetfulness and selective memory. Yeah.
So this is one of 13 graves. They're not recent excavations. Most of them 1909. The 4th grave was found in 1942. Burial 5, as I said, mostly found from the skull and leg bones, but we think it was a whole articulated skeletal remains. It's just poorly preserved, and a separate horse grave. And they're covered by a layer of stones, but no defined mound. Now, we can debate whether there ever was a mound, but this is the kind of evidence that was in a literal reading of this is being used by the TV show Vikings. There's just, so, they're assuming there was no bigger structure. Okay. But what's really interesting is she was dressed with an oval brooch with traces of textile on it, a knife at the hip, and a steer-type bowl at the feet. And it's one of a number of other graves where in Iceland they have a single oval brooch only. So the question is, are these people very poor? One brooch is broken and they're just using a very old single brooch. It's got signs of wear and repair. Or was this almost, where is the other paired brooch? Did they, there's questions here she can't answer, but this object was being selected to dress the dead. Did they only have one left? Or did they deliberately leave one with her and then keep one back as a memento amongst the living? So there's questions here. This was already an old object. Was it valued, but they could only give up one, or was there a deliberate point in giving one and keeping another? But the brooch,
it's very interesting to wonder about.
Yeah,
I like that thought. Like give the dead like one piece of it and let the living keep a piece of it, and then there's a special connection between them because of that. So that's a nice idea.
So so she's arguing that maybe it's been curated and valued for stories and antiquity. Both are. One you're giving one away and you're still valuing it, but you're giving it away to one of the dead, and you're keeping one to maintain that connection. And we can't prove it. I'm not trying to big up this evidence beyond what we've got, but it's an application of what Pettersdottir doesn't really get to in her article. It's an application of how thinking about objects that way, understanding this as part of a sequence in which you're burying the dead and then sacrificing a horse and laying it out afterwards, may have been important. And there's other things I'm just speculating about. She doesn't talk about this, is that maybe there's other ways these objects were linked, like there's a steer-type bowl. If you're sacrificing a horse, are you burying the person with a bowl full of the blood of the horse? Or are you, is there a connection there? I don't think we've ever looked into these things, but we've got to think about how these objects may have not simply be, we'll just put a bowl in the grave. Did they contain beer, or did they contain mead, or did they contain water, or were they actually something to do with the fact you've just killed a horse and its blood is everywhere? These are very, as we'll come on to, these are very violent, bloody, gushing, visceral, killings.
It would have been a very raw and visceral event.
Yeah. So the problem is with her approach is, given the quality of the data for this grave, we can't work out a space and sequence of actions. I'm not saying that's her fault. That's just the nature of the data. And we also need to think about how these graves, by remembering this funeral, how did it inform, how did it respond to previous graves and subsequent graves? And again, that's why we don't have the chronological precision. So I go back, there's still questions here. This is poorly excavated in the early 20th century. You know, if this was excavated today, even with fragmentary evidence, we'd want AMS dating of every burial. You'd want, you know, to proper excavation around the area to make sure there's no other graves. I bet there's more. They didn't look. You know, we'd want a proper investigation to build up a story. But I thought this would help to show how we can then take those ideas from the detailed analysis of graves, the looking at the potential power of objects to be extensions of people, even quite humble objects. And then we can start thinking about how those objects worked in funerals.
Yeah, how they were interconnected and what that tells us about the more general context.
Yeah, not that, oh, this person wasn't very rich because they didn't have 2 brooches. Well, you could argue that, but then, you know, it sounds like it was either a very specific set of choices of what was happening here. Do we have time to go on, or do you want to wrap it up here? Maybe one more case study if you have time.
I have time. It's just that you've already been on since I think we started an hour and a half ago. So
yeah, but I recorded
whichever
it about
you prefer.
I think maybe if I just wrap this up, I think this will make a logical end if I just quickly go through this one.
Great.
And this takes us to a mortuary sequence and thinking about this relatively recent and still interim report from Archaeological Icelandica by Roberts and Hreiðarsdóttir, looking at this one cemetery. And this is the site of Litlunúpar.
Litlunúpar, yeah.
And this is an abandoned farmstead just south of the town of Húsavík in northeast Iceland. So this is Laxdala, I think that's the way you say it, isn't it? As in the saga. And what you've got here is a number of traces known from surveys and mapping and LiDAR of, or aerial photography, sorry, in this case, of a series of farmsteads and boundaries. And on the edge of the home field, part of 3 big enclosures, 14 ruined buildings, they excavated a cemetery from 2004 to 2010. They've got 9 graves, a mixture of humans, horse and dogs, and 1 boat grave, one of only 6 known. And they make this really interesting argument, which is still preliminary, but it helps us to think about these ideas of memory and personhood and the choices of both human and animal associated with this cemetery sequence. The jury is out from my perspective on whether we believe this precise argument, but it's a really tantalizing way that takes us into how we think about cemeteries as active spaces that are being revisited, and we start to think about what we couldn't with the other graves, about how these burials link together. So they found a human burial there in 1915, at least 3 horse burials, and they're all orientated, as with Dalvik, along the contours of the site. And burial 3 seems to be the core of a cluster. So if I can show you here, here's the farmstead, and there's a 19th century sheep house, but here's the trace of various enclosures linked to the Laxda River. And here you've got on the very edge of the home field, as is often the case, this is the whole point. Calling these marginal, I think, is nonsense. You know, they're actually part of the agrarian economy. The graves would have been, landscape,
clearly.
You know, yeah. And so here you've got a boundary wall, and you've got, it's only a small excavation, but still they found burial 3 is the focus. That's the boat grave, and a series of other graves. And I won't. The detail doesn't matter, but you can pause this and look at it in as you go. But we've got at least 6 horse bones of a horse over the age of 5 in burial 1. So this looks like it's a horse burial. Then burial 2, you've got a human burial, and a horse and dog with bits of what I think are saddle and riding gear. And what's really important, excuse me, post holes were found. And I think these would have been missed in older excavations, right? So we've got evidence. We can't be sure that this had some kind of house or
Has some kind of
lean-to
coverage. That's
structure.
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. We can't prove it. The post holes are a bit sketchy. We can't, reconstruct it. We can get some artist in to create an AI generated, massive structure here, or it could be quite a humble little shelter. But there's something. This grave was not just a flat grave where there was no marker. There was clearly marking the graves. Burial 3 is the boat grave. This is very similar to the one I excavated with a project co-directed with Dr. Martin Rundqvist in Sweden. It was a bit bigger. A 7-meter boat cut. 223 clench bolts. That's the evidence of the ship. The wood isn't surviving. It's the clench bolts that hold the there's a faint traces of a keel line, so they did have some hint. And they think the boat was about 6.5 meters. The boat I dug when the boat grave was about 5.2 meters. This is a bit longer, but a small coastal fishing vessel, or local vessel. You could fit a couple of sheep in here. You could fit a couple of people in here.
Right.
You're not going raiding to the British Isles in this. It's just not. But this is a local vessel, right? And also it was really interesting post holes suggesting some kind of marker or structure. And these are the clench bolts where they found them. And this is a small bit of a copper alloy bell, which is a type of Scandinavian object we find in the Western Viking world, suggesting there were some artifacts placed in this grave. But what's really interesting is there were 3 individuals, 2 males, one aged about 45 at death or over, one aged about 35, and a woman. And there are other burials which have post holes. This is really cool. This is right next to burial 3. There's clearly well spaced and organized post holes that could suggest some kind of structure, evidence of a human and a dog, and a little copper alloy brooch, and a possible temporary interment for elsewhere. And the point they make is that there's post holes between these graves. If you look at if I go back here, these 2 post holes, 175 and 177, are right between burials 4 and 3, suggesting they argue some kind of structural relationship. So this is really interesting. And burial 5 is a disturbed double horse burial, and they, at the other end of the grave, and they make the argument that this is actually part of a mortuary complex that's in which burials are being placed and then translated into a family mausoleum provided by the ship burial. This is a bit speculative, but I like it because it helps, whether it's right or not, it helps us to think about these horse burials. And there's also horse burial 6 has they've also a possible at least 2 or 3 more horse burials nearby in grave 7. But what you may be looking at, and this is from another site that hasn't been published yet, I don't think, at least at the time of that article, showing you other graves from a site called Ingridstadir.
Ingridstadir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Where you've got more post holes and stone mounds. So what these sites together, this site and seem to be telling us, is that the cemeteries had vibrant stories. They had structures. They were carefully aligning graves on each other, humans and horses and dogs. You may be looking at, therefore, a really different kind of impression from what we get from the standard stereotype of the Icelandic cemetery as just a few mounds, isolated locations, pagans, liminal. They're on the edge. They're not. And this is the parallel.
This looks very complex and structured.
And given that this is, you've got to appreciate they've only excavated parts of these sites, and they may be missing lots more. And given one of the other ship burials has 7 people in it, it's very unlikely 7 people are going to die at the same time unless it's plague. It could be that these are added successively over time. And so they're making the argument that these boat graves may be almost not single phase burials, but multi-phase mausolea. So they make the argument that maybe, and this is a hypothetical sequence, that they temporarily buried a human and a dog in grave 4 and then transferred to the boat. Then they reopened the boat and added a second human and sacrificed another horse, and then added a third human, perhaps, So, you have I don't want to, this sequence is a bit sketchy, but the idea is, and then it was all robbed later because they found evidence of antiquarian disturbance, and robbing may be actually the family going back to do further honorary rites. It doesn't necessarily mean looting. But, you have a really complex site that's being revisited. And of course, when Christianization took place, they may be going to these graves and removing aspects of them. So it helps us to rethink the cemetery as a space of memory through sequences of funerals and translations and graves and other rituals linking the living and the dead, forging links to place, history and identity. And I think that's my take. That's not theirs. That's where I'm trying to sort of say this kind of evidence is helping us to understand what Pettersdottir was getting at, what Hare Smith and colleagues were getting at, what Norstein was getting at, but putting it into the cemetery context. And I think that's really these kind of work together is helping us build a better, richer picture of Icelandic Viking period pagan cemeteries.
Yeah, so you have essentially a lot of movement here between the living and the dead, between life and death. There's this very complex dynamic process going on with the living constantly basically interacting with the dead. Yeah.
And
it's very interesting landscape to see it on the broader context, how people would have interacted with this whole funerary landscape and how they would have contributed to it. Yeah.
And it may build speculation on speculation, but it helps us to, I think, understand these are something of the saga literature. It's not a direct window onto the saga world that's remembered, but it does help us, I think, to understand these are spaces. No one's forgetting these graves. No one's going, they're over there somewhere. Who knows? These are.
Yeah, they're not static now.
Yeah. And I think it's starting to help us understand these communities and these graves are not, we can't get their voices, but they are telling us a story of how they're remembering, how they're constructing their sense of place and identity and history through graves in that landscape.
Yeah, now some of these stories are really preserved until like more recent times. Like you have a lot of folklore about, for example, taboo areas where you shouldn't plow or you shouldn't take your animals because something at some point went out there. So yeah, also this idea of the hidden people as well might have been a remnant, the Huldufolk of that sort of thing. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think maybe that's a good point to sort of close today's conversation. And because I had other case studies to look at, but I think they build on what we're discussing here. And I thought next time we could look a bit more at cremation, horse sacrifice.
Horses, absolutely.
And maybe get onto some of the Christian period, the transition with Christian conversion, where the graves and the dead didn't become less important. They and there's interesting stories the archaeologists telling us that sort of we can look at in relation to the saga literature about how memory and mounds or memory and graves are interacting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Howard, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all those who managed to follow to the end. Hope this was informative for you. It must have been informative for you. And we would be happy to continue the series. So guess I'll see you next time with horse burials and many other interesting topics about the archaeology of Viking Age Iceland and beyond.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.